Welcome back to Gold Derby. I'm Christopher Rosen. I'm so pleased to be joined by Todd Banhazl, cinematographer of Winning Time. He did episodes 1, 2, 5, 6, 9, and 10, which is the finale. We were just talking briefly before we started recording. I absolutely love the show. The visuals are unbelievable. And I guess, it felt so unique to me watching it. I guess where did you start and how did you approach this? What were your first conversations with Adam McKay like, I guess?
Thank you, first of all. Our first conversations were about the script. And I mean, from the beginning, the script has this like sarcastic, self-referential tone, and the script talks about like incorporating like real archival from the period. So like, I think we knew initially that like the show was going to be mixing this like comedic self-referential style where you're talking to camera, but also this like documentary style and sort of like bringing the period to life. So from the beginning, we knew we wanted to shoot on film and we knew we wanted to mix formats. I mean, it was like, it's the first thing we talked about, you know?
So then how do you go about I guess watching it, I was like, how are you mixing the formats and like how much coverage are you doing? Like, I mean, I'm assuming it's like 16 millimeter cameras, 8 millimeter cameras. It feels like I'm a total Luddite, so I don't know, but it felt like even like VHS camera perhaps or something like that. Like, are you shooting like multiple cameras at the same time and then like just sending that off to like Hank Corwin or whatever to edit it? Like, how does it work?
Yeah, I mean, it's like once we tested the hell out of all these different cameras, we kind of like found our cocktail. It was like the main look is 35 millimeter. It's like based on like old Ektachrome or Kodachrome like print stocks from back then. And then the second look is the 8 millimeter look, which we said is more for like time and place. It's kind of like set up like interesting details and also to like replicate like archival footage, things like that. And then we started testing cameras, the exact cameras that shot the basketball games back then. It's like these old tube cameras. And we discovered it's these like Ikegami tube cameras. They're like pre-digital. I mean, they're those video cameras that have like the warping lights and that really like gross, beautiful video look, you know? So we knew we were going to use those cameras to shoot the basketball games, but then we started testing them. And me and McKay fell in love with the Ikegamis like in a close-up on an actor's face, you know, and we realized you could use those video cameras as like another emotional tool, you know? So, I mean, we ended up shooting most scenes with two 35 millimeter cameras and either the 8 millimeter or the Ikegami cameras. And it's kind of like, you know, we had a rule book, but then we'd also like break the rules if it felt right, you know? And then we kind of gave all these aesthetics to our brilliant editors, starting with Hank and the team, where the jazz continued with it.
So you mentioned the performances. I was curious about that. Like, I love the performances in this show. It feels like, I mean, from like John C. Reilly, just incredible. But like discoveries, like Quincy Isaiah, obviously, Solomon Hughes playing Kareem and Magic and Kareem, respectively. How much did the different styles of cameras and stuff affect their performances? Did you notice it affecting the performances? It feels like, again, to me as a viewer, I was like, oh, this is so. It feels so authentic and natural, almost like there is no camera there. And I guess, did you notice that, like when they're like, when you're holding like an 8 millimeter camera, basically, or like you're saying that the Ikegamis, like, is it like, is it just open up the performance in a way that maybe was unexpected?
Yeah, I mean, I think we treated them all like invisible cameras. So the hope is that the actors are able just to do their work. I mean, we also kind of lit in a way that tries to be as much like 360 as possible so that the actors can kind of work freely. And that's like that documentary feeling, you know? So I hope that the cameras don't interrupt the performance, but more like the styles give an audience like a different way of seeing the actors in the middle of the scene, you know, like you can see like Magic or Jerry Buss with all this like bravado and like machismo, and you can see that on like 35 millimeter in these like big crane shots, you know, but you can also see them at the same time in the next cut on like this really vulnerable kind of ugly video camera shot, you know, that's like a super close up. And in that way, like you can kind of like see them as these like mythic characters of like our culture and also see them as vulnerable human beings, you know, at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Unbeknownst to their characters, you know what I mean? Like in some ways it's like the cameras are there to like catch them in these moments, you know?
Right. It's awesome. You mentioned, like, it feels like, I mean, again, feels like to me it's like a big swing, like all of these like styles and stuff, and you obviously connect really well. Was there a moment when you guys are like in the pilot or any of these episodes you're like, oh yeah, this is really right, like when you knew you had it right, like, and especially with like the mixing of styles and film formats and stuff?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the joy, I think, of like the pilot, especially, was that we were able to try all these things. I mean, that comes from McKay down. It's like as a team, we're given the freedom to try things. And, you know, like McKay always said, like, if it doesn't feel right, we won't use it. You know, it's the same thing with like the actors talking to camera. Like we tried in a wide, you tried in a close up, you tried in an over the shoulder, and you discover like the most fun, interesting ways to do that, you know, to break the fourth wall. I mean, the moment for me came like we knew 8 millimeter was going to be used for like establishing shots and inserts and kind of give it like a feeling of like bringing the period back to life. Like the 8mm one to feel like you had found the footage labeled in a box, you know, from like 40 years ago that said like Lakers 1979. But we were shooting in the pilot young Magic, like a flashback of young Magic, maybe like 9-year-old Magic, practicing in the snow in Lansing, Michigan. And before we shot the scene, it was like dusk. And our C camera, our 8mm operator, Justin Cameron, looked over and noticed that the boy, the actor, was practicing basketball before we shot. And he just went over there with the 8mm camera and he got in there and he just shot young Magic practicing and, you know, like calling out, you know, the game while he's playing. And that footage came back and it is so magical. I mean, it feels like a childhood memory. And I think that's like when it came alive for us, we realized like, oh, this can be used in really emotional ways. And from there, we just started using it like that in scenes, knowing that we could like, you could evoke memory or a time period or an emotion with the different formats, you know. But I think that was the aha moment for everyone, you know, for our showrunner, for our editors,
That's awesome. It is really, really cool. You mentioned the recreation too. I guess for you, when you're like, how much are you like trying to completely mirror what that basketball action was in the games versus like, obviously like the show is the show. It's not a documentary. So like how much you want to, you know, obviously like impart that look, like the visual style, and like people are familiar with like how an old basketball game looked, but also like make it original to the show. I guess how did you guys talk about that in the recreation of the games, I guess?
Yeah, of the basketball. I mean, I think our writer, Rodney Barnes, always said that we're not just shooting basketball, we're shooting story and emotion within basketball. And I think like that's where the difference comes. Like we always started with the real games, especially like the very famous legendary plays. So we always had those as a reference. And especially like our basketball coordinator, Adon, like had those as the base. But from there, it became about like getting the camera emotionally specific within the scene, you know? Mm-hmm. So the conversations were like, okay, this is what really happened in the game. And this is what's really in the script. And then from there, it's like, whose perspective are we in and whose emotional perspective are we in? And what does the audience need to understand about what is happening between these players in the game and why does it matter? You know? So, I mean, I feel like the basis is all like thematically and historically accurate, but from there, what's happening emotionally, then comes down to what's happening to our characters in our script, you know?
Yeah, no, I think that really works. Do you like, I want to ask, not to harp on the basketball. The other thing I found fascinating, especially in the finale with the finals game, is that like, wow, it's just so exciting. I was watching it, like, I'm like, I know they win, obviously. It's like a historic event. And I'm just like, hell yeah, like watching them, you know, like it really feels, I mean, they are playing, obviously, like Quincy Isaiah is like doing no look passes, and it just is unbelievable. And the way it's shot is so cool. And it's like thrilling as like a sporting event, even though it's fictional or a recreation of a real event. Right. So like, how did you guys do that? Like, how did you keep up with the pace of the action of basketball and like make it feel like an actual basketball game? Basically, I just found that so fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, that was the big challenge for us throughout the entire season. I mean, it's like, all as the Lakers gel and get better as a team, we also gelled and figured out better ways of shooting it. And it kind of like the two teams kind of grew together, which I think works for the script, you know? I mean, the big thing, like we use the normal tools. There's like, we had platform dollies to run the court. We had cranes when it was right. We had Steadicam, and there's a lot of handheld to make it feel like documentary, like it's really happening. And the Ikegami 2 cameras are also magic. I mean, when you shoot the game with these old TV cameras, it's crazy at the monitor. I mean, it looks like it's from 1979. It's wild. But I think the big trick for us was this rollerblade operator, which kind of like unlocked the whole thing. It was a suggestion from my key grip. We found this guy, John Like, who's a extreme sports operator, camera operator. And he came in, we gave him a little 16mm camera and a little backpack rig that would send a video signal out. And he would rollerblade with the players and do these like really complicated one takes of the plays. And I mean, that's what opened it up for us. Like, that's how we got the camera to stay with the emotional and kinetic experience of the players. I mean, we started blocking him like he was a player, you know, like at the rehearsal days, we'd bring him in and we'd watch the plays, and he'd do it with skates and an iPhone. And we'd say, like, okay, like he can wrap around Kareem, and then he can take the pass and land in Magic, go up to Magic's face, wrap around again. You know, it's like, finally we had a camera that could keep up with the ball. So, I mean, he's the secret weapon for sure.
That's amazing. It's so cool. And it really does. I mean, you're right. Like, it does feel like when going into the show, I was like, how are they going to recreate obviously like the Showtime Lakers that is such a synonymous with like just such fast break, quick play, like just like so much fun. And then the show just nails it. And you're right. Like, especially as the season goes along, it's really remarkable. You mentioned like or I think you did. I think it was maybe episode 5. There's a big Kareem episode. I think is 5 maybe, and I felt like a lot of that stuff. I feel like the way the show handles Kareem is so interesting. And I guess how did you approach like that, like Kareem as a character? I guess because he's so much more. I mean, conflicted. I think than Magic, and certainly while Magic has his own conflicts, Kareem is like obviously the savvy veteran, has been through a lot and has like a lot more, I think, going on. Certainly, it just feels like he has a lot going on. I guess how did you guys approach like shooting Kareem, not just on the court, I mean, but like in the domestic scenes and stuff? I found that really interesting. I think that is episode 5 when it's like most of him at home. I just love that episode. I thought that was like a really great one, and I know you shot it, so I would love to know what you guys are doing there.
Yeah, I love that episode too. It's so human, that episode. I feel like
that's great. That's a great word. Yeah.
I mean, the big thing about Kareem is like, for me, is that he starts off like Kareem the character, right? Like Kareem the character in the beginning of the show starts off a bit of like a punchline, right? He's like cursing at that kid who wants an autograph, and then he slowly becomes like probably the most developed character in the whole show, and I think episode 5, like a lot of it for us was visually about feeling Kareem towering above everyone else and being like separated from these worlds that he inhabits, right? So like in the beginning, when he's in Harlem, when he's getting his Muslim name, like he towers, even though he's kneeling, he's like towering above all the other people who are praying, and around his other players, he's towering above them. And I think like the big thing in that episode for me is like he also lives in like a mansion above Los Angeles. It's like he's separated from these things that he cares about, these like the world, he's emotionally separated at this point, and that's like he's lost, and eventually when he refines his path, he kneels and his head, he kneels on the ground when he's praying. So I think like a lot of it is about like that, like, there's a line at the end of the episode that's like, that's why God made you tall, so that you could inspire other men, but that's why he gave you knees, so you could kneel,
really,
so
no, that's amazing. That's really amazing, and I love hearing you talking about it. It's so cool, and you just get all that visually without even having to necessarily say it, which I think is like a really good, obviously filmmaking, visual medium, so it's great to get that kind of character beats without even having to say it. It's so cool. So I mean, like, we're talking here about season 1, like I said, it's incredible achievement. I think all of these episodes were great and loved it so much. Season 2 is happening right now. Are you coming back for season 2, or like how have you guys talked about season 2 yet, or have, like, and how do you try to top what you did this season, because it was so like visually original, I feel like, and kind of like to see that. I know obviously from a Adam McKay standpoint, his films have like kind of shifted towards this a lot lately, but like the mixing of styles. But from a TV perspective, I just found it like it's seemingly like not like a lot of other shows. So like, I guess that's a 2-part question, but like season 2, and then how do you top season 1, I guess?
Yeah. I mean, I guess that's funny because that's also the question for the team thematically in the show, right? Is like when Jerry Buss wins, it's like, cool, you won. What's next? And he's like, I guess we do it all over again. It's like that thing, like you're climbing this mountain, but like for what, I mean, we're talking about season 2. I'm not sure if I can say much about it, but I know like for me, if and when it happens, I'm excited to dig the themes visually further, and push the formats further. And, we always joke like, if I can figure out a format that they can invent, we'll use it. I mean, it's, I think there are more paintbrushes. I think of these different formats as different ways of seeing these characters and seeing this world. So I'm curious, like, as the scripts arrive, what kinds of aesthetics can help like back those ideas up, So yeah, I mean, I always want to push it further. Otherwise, why are we doing this?
That was basically the last question, but I got one more because I thought of it while you were talking there. It's pushing the show. Obviously, the pilot episode starts with like Magic is after his HIV diagnosis. That happens in the I think 90, right? Or 91. 91. So obviously that's like a different era than what we're doing. So can you talk about how you like, did you shoot that like obviously like with the 90s, like 91 in mind? How did you do that? I just found that part really fascinating because again, when I put it on, it's like the first scene, you're just like, whoa, what am I watching here? It feels like I found this VHS tape. And again, like, so how did you guys do that part, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, 91 was shot on Betacams, which are like video cameras that were shot around the 90s. I mean, the initial idea was that like as we travel through time and flashbacks, we try to match the aesthetic generally to the main cameras that were used at that time for either advertising or news. I mean, the idea is to like look at how Americans saw America on TV and kind of like reinterpret that. So like the 90s was the Betacam, which was like the dominant news cameras. Obviously the 70s and 80s is like the Ikegami tube cameras and the Ektachrome look, which is like the big photo, like that was the big Kodak stock for advertising at the time. But, you know, Kareem's flashback you were talking about, so his flashback is shot in like a really colorful Kodachrome look and also a black and white 16 millimeter look, which was based on news footage of the Harlem protests in the 60s, you know? So it's like the aesthetics, the formats follow the time periods in that way, you know?
Yeah.
It's like it's a collage. It's a look at America. It's a reinterpretation of America via the way the photographic means that we've seen America, you know?
It's I will wrap this up, but I'm just fascinated by this whole thing. How long, I mean, like when you're doing, it sounds like having to go through all of that, how much research are you doing before even the show? You know what I mean? Like, it seems like to have that kind of like, oh, like this is, we're kind of pulling all these different threads of like American history from like the 70s to the 90s, 1990, basically. Like, how much time are you spending on research and like like finding visuals that you're like, oh, that's like kind of like something that would be inspiring for what we're doing here or whatever?
Yeah, I mean the researching, that's the most fun part. I mean, months, you know, months it's of testing and researching and like looking at what the scripts are talking about and then looking at the real events that they're based on and researching how those events, you know, what footage of those events actually exists and what actually what formats were used to shoot those things and then testing them. And yeah, I mean, that's I always love testing, but this show especially was all about, I think my producers cracked up. We've never worked with a DP who's tested as much of you as you. And I mean, partly I think that's me, and partly I think it's just the nature of this show is like everything we're doing, not that it hasn't been done before, but like there's a very, you know, every scene is asking for something very specific and kind of unique. So it takes like maybe a more complex look at what we're doing before we get there on the day.
Yeah. It's great stuff. As you can tell, I'm a big fan. Todd Banhazl, cinematographer of Winning Time, episodes 1, 2, 5, 6, 9, and 10. And if you haven't seen Hustlers, which I can't imagine you haven't, please watch Hustlers. It rules. And Todd's cinematographer on that as well. It's a great film. So thank you, Todd, for doing this. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.